Whenever I want to trigger my own personal terror of the passage of time and the fragile nature of human memory and experience, I just recall that, at some point in my lifetime, first-person shooters weren't a thing. I mean, they existed, sure, in the same way that movies starring Captain America existed. However, at some point, games played from the avatar's perspective stopped being the interesting yet flawed gimmickry of forgotten gems like 3D Monster Chase and became unstoppable industry juggernauts like Wolfenstein and Doom. Although at the time of writing this script, the video game landscape isn't truly oversaturated by any one single genre, there have been times in recent memory when the FPS dominated the industry completely. Thanks to this epidemic of Doom cloning and Call of Duty copycats, the Wikipedia entry for the first-person shooter is... well, it's something. The name's important. Not important. What is important? Why... Number 10. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Love it, loathe it, or feel ambivalent about it, or maybe you didn't even play it, maybe you weren't old enough at the time, maybe you were at college and trying to pretend you're too cool for games. Anyway, I'm sidetracking myself. Call of Duty has become a divisive series thanks to its definition, and some might argue dilution of the FPS genre in the latter part of the 2000s. The series started in the World War II shooter boom that followed Medal of Honor, but led the charge in switching theatres of war to the modern battleground. This second game in the Modern Warfare subseries embraced and expanded the original theatrical campaign storyline, playing with the themes of political intrigue, extremism and terror, while stretching credibility somewhat in the pursuit of spectacle. As before, the player character switches between members of Special Forces Task Force 141 and US Army Rangers as the storyline dictates. Gameplay remains mostly unchanged, defined by linear missions, relatively lightweight enemies regenerating health, and a reliance on using aim-down sights or ADS for accuracy. What kept most players returning to MW2 far beyond the end of the campaign was of course the multiplayer. Most players' fondest memories of MW2 are being shouted at by hyperactive teenagers in online multiplayer. Call of Duty 4's kill streaks and non-stop progression system is back, and this time it's turned up to 11. In addition to the enhanced presentation and new levels, there's added weapons, perks, a new kill streak customization system, with some improved balance through the reduction of cheap revenge kills and camping spots. Note, I said reduction. On top of this, there's the new Spec Ops mode. This co-op set of self-contained levels takes Call of Duty 4's arcade mode and runs with it, creating scenarios that are varied and rewarding and every bit as memorable as the main multiplayer mode. Most reviews from 2009 were written from the less jaded perspective of critics who hadn't yet had their fill of gritty modern shooters. Except for some criticism of the campaign's length and OTT action movie style plot, write-ups were almost universally full of praise, earning Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 a collective score of 94. Number 9. Bioshock Infinite. Where the Call of Duty games have come to epitomise the mass market appeal of the online FPS, the Shock series typifies the appeal of the single-player game. Since its spiritual predecessor System Shock, the series has been a prime example of storytelling through the first-person vantage point. Infinite is the third and so far final game in the Bioshock series. Returning to the high-concept plots of the original Bioshock, this time leaving the underwater setting of Rapture for the airborne city of Columbia. The story follows player character Booker and his Mark-turned-ally Elizabeth as they navigate the troubled city of Columbia, an early 20th century haven for followers of a twisted American dream, caught between the forces of cult leader Zachary Comstock and those of the rebellious Vox Populi who seek to overthrow him. Of course, one could not take a swipe at existing and somewhat thriving political ideologies in the 2010s without various groups taking umbrage, with armchair activists from across the political spectrum expressing outrage at the game's perceived depiction of American exceptionalism, theocracy, racism and xenophobia, and the labour movement. There are also a few noted examples of occasions where in-game propaganda imagery was recycled by real-life political and news agencies, resulting in more than a few facepalms among people who'd actually played the game. Take that incendiary political intrigue, throw in a heavy dose of many worlds theorising and quantum physics, and you've got the recipe for a critical success, as well as a slightly messy, confusing ending that left people scratching their heads. Nevertheless, the gaming press heaped acclaims onto Bioshock Infinite, earning it 94 overall. Number 8. Halo 2. Released 3 years after the first game, Halo 2 once more showed what the Xbox was capable of, with developers Bungie managing to better leverage the hardware to increase the audio and graphical fidelity further, lending the player an incredibly immersive and cinematic experience. Gameplay-wise, Bungie didn't change the recipe much. Some weapons were rebalanced, notably the Needler, and the addition of dual wielding adds a little absurdity to the proceedings. Although combat evolved, as well as certain other releases we may or may not be covering later in this video, can claim to have popularised the FPS genre on consoles, competitive multiplayer was still considered to be a largely PC platform phenomena. Enter Halo 2. This second chapter in Microsoft's flagship series supplemented its predecessor's local split-screen and network multiplayer with the option to play online, getting fragged by complete strangers, most of whom, as it turns out, have had intimate relations with your mother. Small world, eh? However, just because you achieve something new doesn't mean that the end product will be a defining moment in the genre. In fact, that could be the subject of a future video, Top 10 Forgotten Innovations in Gaming. Anyway, I digress. Considering its fraught development, Halo 2 could still have sank without a trace if its online multiplayer had sucked. As you can probably guess, it didn't. Halo 2 introduced a whole generation of gamers to the world of deathmatch, and defined concepts like matchmaking and lobbies that permeate the genre to this day, inspiring every FPS that followed and paving the way for franchises like Battlefield and Call of Duty to dominate the market. Bungie's level design was top-notch, with memorable designs like Coagulation, Lockout and Zanzibar earning the admiration of fans for years to come. And yes, the shooting was really bloody fun. So, I've been talking for a couple of minutes about Halo 2 now without even mentioning the single-player mode. And that's probably why I'm talking about the sequel before the original. Although the gameplay itself is polished, the graphics enhanced to further stress the original Xbox's hardware, and the new weapons and enemy types are worthy additions, the story itself left many fans disappointed. The shift in player character for a substantial chunk of the game didn't go down well with the fanbase, and let's not even get started on the cliff. Number 7. Half-Life. Cast your mind back to the mid-1990s, if you can. First-person shooter technology on the PC was advancing at such a pace that the cutting edge of 3D games progressed from Doom's raycast pseudo-3D engine to Quake's dynamically lit texture-mapped polygons in less than 3 years. Audio likewise benefited from the technology boom, allowing digitised sampled sounds and CD-quality music for the first time in a world still accustomed to PCs sounding like R2-D2. What wasn't progressing at the same pace was storytelling. Quake's plot, if you can call it that, was dumped in the same way as that of Doom, and if anything was less well developed than in Wolfenstein 3D. Doom Guy and Quake Guy didn't even earn a name, unlike BJ Blazkowicz. Spectacle and sensation were prioritised over story, and while this sits well enough with a certain niche of gamers, the critical media is looking for balance in all things. Doom and Quake, and later Unreal and Battlefield, may well sit pretty in the sales figures, but will never be the darlings of the reviewers. Half-Life changed things. Not in some unique, unheard-of manner. It wasn't like developers had never considered the possibility of telling a story from the first-person perspective, or creating an interactive movie, a buzzword of the time. These things had been done, and for the most part done poorly. Valve, in their first attempt, did it well. Spectacularly well. There are no walls of expository text, no cutscenes. The story progresses through the action and through character monologues, technically dialogue, though, Gordon Freeman. The end result felt more than ever before like playing through the events of a movie. Storytelling aside, Half-Life also excelled in other areas. Sound design, art direction and AI were all cutting edge for the time and marked a high point in the early days of the first-person shooter. This earned universal acclaim from the review community of the time, including numerous Game of the Year awards. It has retrospectively been considered one of the most important games of the 1990s, and is considered by some one of the best games ever. Not even best first-person shooters, best games. Half-Life scored an average of 96 according to Metacritic. Number 6. Goldeneye 007. As has previously been mentioned, the first-person shooter genre was once considered one of the backbones of the PC platform. Doom, Wolfenstein, Duke Nukem 3D, Dark Forces, Chex Quest. Every major franchise of the genre had its roots on the IBM compatible. There are valid arguments why this would be the case, though most will cite the advantage of the mouse and keyboard as the input method of choice for a game whose very definition is point and shoot. In the 1990s, when console controllers consisted of a handful of buttons and a D-pad, the fine control necessary to have an enjoyable FPS experience was lacking. Enter Nintendo, whose answer to the upstart PlayStation was the N64. In a dramatic technological leap from its predecessor, the SNES, or Super Famicom, the N64 skipped 32-bit architecture entirely and implemented powerful 3D hardware acceleration thanks to a collaboration with industry giants SGI. Crucially, Nintendo also supported this 3D focus with a radical new controller. Although it can, with hindsight, be judged as a nightmare of ergonomic design, it featured one of the N64's grand innovations, the analog stick. Thanks to this, the first large-scale adoption of its kind in gaming controllers, developers had a path to bringing FPS games to the console masses. Among the first fruits of this new round of console-exclusive FPS development was Rare's James Bond movie tie-in, Goldeneye 007. So, let's recap the red flags here. A new console, a traditionally PC-based genre, a bizarre controller design, a movie tie-in, and a studio who'd never done a first-person shooter before. At the time, people were sceptical. Thankfully, early reviews were strong. Whether or not the British spy movie genre translated well around the globe, the gameplay was what brought gamers in. The control layout, while bizarre by contemporary standards, was surprisingly effective compared to the alternatives. The graphics might look, let's be charitable and say, dated now, but they were cutting edge at the time, and the plot, lifted directly from the movie, sort of, along with the famous James Bond gadgets and theme music, made this a more faithful movie adaptation than many that preceded it. However, what set Goldeneye apart was the feature that most PC games lacked, that of split-screen multiplayer. In a time when the internet couldn't support fast-paced online gaming and LAN parties were reserved for actual nerds, many gamers' first deathmatch experiences were of huddling around a tiny CRT with their friends, peeking at one another's corner of the screen to grab an easy frag. Goldeneye is remembered fondly by gamers and the review press as the game that sold 1 million N64s, and earns a well-deserved 96 on Metacritic. If you're enjoying the video so far, would you kindly click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to be notified when I upload a new video. Cheers! On the subject of would you kindly, number 5, Bioshock. For those who sat through my summary of Bioshock Infinite thinking, meh, the first one was better, relax, the world agrees with you, by the slimmest of margins. The original Bioshock launched in 2007 at a time when intellectual condemnation of far-right ideology was trending online and in the media. Adding to this discussion, Bioshock presents the player with the what-if scenario of an underwater city known as Rapture, built by fictional 20th century industrialist Andrew Ryan, as a utopia for those who subscribe to his ideals of individual liberty at the expense of such weaknesses as altruism. By the game's setting of an alternate 1960, society within this hermetically sealed experiment has broken down into literal class war, powered by a substance known as Adam that grants the user superhuman powers, or plasmids. The player fights their way through the denizens of Rapture, known as splicers, using firearms, plasmids, and more often than not a pipe wrench, to confront their antagonist and escape. The gameplay style should be familiar to anyone who played System Shock or its sequel. On the one hand, you have your choice of steampunk-esque firearms with largely satisfying gunplay. On the other, you have the choice of plasmids with which you gain powers like damage over time, stun, knockback, etc. Both weapon choices present the player with issues of scarcity. Whether it's ammunition or EVE, the resources that fuel your offensive weapons are limited and must be carefully managed. As with the sequel, Bioshock has something to say. The story of Rapture was a critique of the objectivist ideology of philosopher Ayn Rand and followers of libertarian beliefs. The plot shows a potential outcome of an environment where everyone is encouraged to live only for themselves, and ultimately rewards the player for having made positive moral choices throughout the game, in contrast to the bad ending brought about by taking certain easy options. Can you tell how hard I'm trying not to give any spoilers? And yes, there's some room for less positive criticism of Bioshock. From a gameplay standpoint, there's not a huge amount of variety in enemy types, and AI isn't its strongest suit. There's also an argument to be made about ludonarrative dissonance, where the enforced moral choices don't feel integral to the gameplay, the difficulty associated with playing the game in a moral manner, or the rewards available to tempt you to play amorally aren't sufficient to promote either playstyle, and that the game's black and white morality choices feel almost superfluous. Bioshock is considered by many one of the examples of video games as an actual art form, promoting a change in the discourse around video games. For this, Bioshock edges out Bioshock Infinite with an aggregate score of 96. Number 4. Half-Life 2. If you're familiar with the FPS genre, you were probably expecting this game to be on the list. Some of you might be surprised it's not higher up. The hype for Valve's second Half-Life game was immense before its release in 2004, and expectations could not have been higher. This was not aided at all by a somewhat fraught development cycle involving long hours, pushback deadlines, and an incident with a leaked alpha of the game in October 2003, revealing how far from complete the game was. Despite all of this, Half-Life 2 for PC finally hit store shelves in August 2004, and simultaneously available for download via producer Valve's then controversial digital delivery platform Steam. Like its predecessor, Half-Life 2 is told from the perspective of silent protagonist Gordon Freeman, never leaving his viewpoint. While there are several scripted, predefined story sequences, there are no actual cutscenes. The story progresses linearly, yet organically. This time, beyond the walls of Black Mesa, you are thrown sometime into the future in a post-alien invasion Earth, tasked with overthrowing the alien overlords and their human collaborators. Gameplay picks up from the previous game, with many familiar tropes returning. Pistols, shotguns, submachine guns and the like all return as before, as does the weirdly iconic crowbar. The key new addition, courtesy of the Havoc physics engine, is the gravity gun. With this tool, you're able to pick up objects within the game world, move them, place them down, or fire them like a giant projectile. The gravity gun itself wasn't the first of its kind in gaming, but it did mark the first time that such an item was used effectively within a game without feeling like a gimmick. Half-Life 2 is a game that's often described as holding up. While technology has advanced far beyond what the Source engine was capable of at the time, a big part of what strikes players about Half-Life 2 even a decade and a half later is the facial animations. Human characters have their own unique design and range of expressions that make them relatable without taking an unfortunate turn down the uncanny valley that plagues character design in other games. As a work of level design, art style, game mechanics, animation and storytelling, Half-Life 2 excels almost across the board. Half-Life 2 holds a score of 96 on Metacritic, and, in this humble voiceover guy's opinion, deserves to be at the top of the list. Number 3. Halo Combat Evolved. While Goldeneye proved to the industry that the multiplayer FPS could succeed on a console, unfortunately it alone could not guarantee a win, and Nintendo conceded domination of the 5th generation to the PlayStation. When the 6th generation rolled around, Sony themselves were faced with the same struggle, this time from PC software giant Microsoft. The new project from Team Green had managed to secure Studio Bungie's new title from under the noses of bitter rival Apple to produce Halo Combat Evolved as an exclusive launch title for their new Xbox. Halo opens with a cinematic cutscene as the spaceship you're aboard, the Pillar of Autumn, is overrun by the forces of the Covenant, forcing its crew to abandon ship to the titular ring-shaped world. Playing the role of the armoured, visored super soldier referred to as Master Chief, the player is delivered some exposition from the ship's Captain Keyes and AI navigator Cortana before being thrown into the action. Your goal is to escape the Autumn before fighting the Covenant on the planet below and uncovering the unnaturally formed world's secrets. The story is dramatic, high-concept sci-fi that builds or implies a deep lore, which has evolved over the game's many sequels, prequels and fiction tie-ins, and gave Xbox that most coveted trophy among consoles, a mascot. Halo popularised several FPS tropes that would make their way into games for many years to come, including regenerating health, in this case shields, a 2-weapon limit, and rapid grenade access. While split-screen multiplayer was still a thing, Xbox also popularised the ability to link multiple consoles in what would have been considered a LAN party for filthy casuals by the PCMR. Gameplay is of course immensely satisfying, with superb gunplay and excellent sounds, and level design that is superb the first time you see it. But, well, it could be said that some designs are seen a little too often. The regenerating shield system helps build the feeling of playing the ultimate badass. and charging in head first while firing off a stream of assault rifle rounds or sniping with the obscenely powerful pistol were indeed the state of the badass art. Alien weapons had their own charm, with the possible exception of the Needler, and different enemies had their own behaviour types and strategies required to efficiently dispatch them. Also, if you didn't feel some small amount of pity for the poor grunts, you probably need an empathy check, you monster. Halo is credited with Xbox's success and building Microsoft's brand with gamers, and as such its legacy has been cemented. Although it might never usurp Half-Life 2 in my personal top 10, I've still played an awful lot of Halo, and the Master Chief Collection released on PC recently has given me another excuse to go back to it. And in a shameless plug, why not check out this video on my second channel? Metacritic records an aggregate score for Halo Combat Evolved of 97, tying it with the next two games in my list for the best FPS ever. Number 2, Metroid Prime. It's a truly rare breed of game that successfully transitions from 2D to 3D. Mario managed it, Sonic had a few false starts before sort of giving up, and many others botched it completely. Metroid Prime, developed by Retro Studios and launched on Nintendo's GameCube. Metroid Prime, developed by Retro Studios and launched on Nintendo's GameCube in 2002, proves to belong firmly in the first group. By this time, the groundwork for first-person shooters on consoles had already been laid, and the technology, including the input method, had evolved to fully integrate 3D games. Metroid Prime places the player back in control of bounty hunter Samus as she blasts, platforms, and somehow rolls up into a ball and spins around like Sonic through the alien world of Talon 4, with its mix of environment types such as snow, lava, ruins, and underground. The game's ultimate goal is the collection of artifacts to allow the player to proceed to confrontations with perennial series baddie Ridley, or Meta Ridley as this incarnation is known, and finally the titular Metroid Prime. Gameplay-wise, Metroid Prime differs from most games in the list in that it isn't strictly a test of shooting skills, as Retro decided to implement a lock-on style of aiming and instead leave the player to concentrate on strategy and movement. In keeping with the Metroid game genre, aka the Metroidvania, movement is key to the game design, and platforming is handled more elegantly than in many other FPS games of the era. Half-Life. Levels are laid out to provide roadblocks to prevent progress until certain criteria are met, in this case represented by the acquisition of upgrades to Samus's suits, weapons, and morph ball. This progression system lends itself to a feeling of accomplishment, rewarding the player for acquiring an upgrade by letting you feel like an absolute boss as you smash through previously difficult encounters with ease, before rewarding you with new areas requiring further skill and strategy to complete. It is for this reason, and presumably this reason alone as the story is pretty generic run-of-the-mill fare, that Metroid Prime has garnered a loyal fan base and a ton of respect in the press. Metroid Prime is jointly held as the best FPS of all time, with a mighty 97 on Metacritic, though some people who are fans of the game and some people who aren't fans of the game would argue it's not really an FPS. So tell me what you think in the comments below. Number 1. Perfect Dark. Well, this is a bit awkward. For the first time in my top 10 writing career, I have to talk about a game I know very little about that is apparently very highly regarded. Honestly, Perfect Dark slipped under my radar at the time of release, so it came as a surprise to me to see that it was such a big hit with critics. I decided to put some time in and familiarise myself with the game, originally released in 2000 on the Nintendo 64. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised at the game's critical reception, as it has real pedigree, another first-person spy 'em up, or FPSEU, copyright pending, from the team behind Goldeneye. Perfect Dark puts you in the polygonal shoes of the unlikely named protagonist Joanna Dark as you take a trip into a wonderfully 90s vision of the future year of 2023, full of corporations, conspiracies, keycards, aliens, and slinky badass babes. Take that, patriarchy! Behind the veneer though, Perfect Dark is a competent spiritual successor to Rare's other iconic FPS, refines and improves on the formula in every measurable way, with better animation and graphics, including some lighting effects which actually look surprisingly nice even today, enhanced AI, digitised voices, as well as the benefits of not being hamstrung by the confines of a James Bond licence. Performance is still bad, but at least given the graphical upgrade, the excuse is plausible. Rare were neophytes to the FPS genre in 1997, but by 2000 they had refined their skills, enlarged their team, and learned to work within the limitations of the N64. Plot-wise, Perfect Dark takes cues from cyberpunk influences like Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell, as well as some of the popular media of the time from La Femme Nikita to The X-Files. Joanna Dark is thrown into a story of warring alien factions, clones, the President of the United States, an alien called Elvis, and even a trip off-world. Is this the recipe for the best first-person shooter ever? Based on my playthrough so far? I don't know. The gameplay is very enjoyable, and the graphics must have been impressive even if the frame rate was not. As you can see from the captured footage, running Perfect Dark on the 1964 emulator with mouse and keyboard is a smooth, responsive dream. However, footage captured on original hardware will show you a very different story, so all those positive reviews from 20 years ago were of a version of the game that ran at 12 to 15 frames per second. Also, the plot to me seems like a contrived B-grade mess, not taking the time to build any kind of character introduction or even tell a very cohesive story, but maybe you had to play it at the time to appreciate the brilliance of it. Maybe there's some grand twist later on that turns the whole game on its head, but I'm just not feeling this as the greatest FPS of all time. I can't help but wonder if the high Metacritic score is a result of the game benefiting from a hugely hyped release and some extremely favourable reviews from the gaming press at the time, and in this instance I feel that the user score might reflect more fairly on the game. I mean, tell me I'm wrong, that's what the comments are for after all, but Perfect Dark is a good game. In the context of its time and platform, it's a very good game. I'm not about to call it the greatest. And that's my list. Not a very high note to end on, I know, but let me know down below which games you think deserve their spot on the list, which have been overlooked, and why you agree with me that Half-Life 2 deserved to be number 1. While you're down there, would you kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.